So there is a sense only in the last 5 or 10 years that nuclear power has become too expensive.
What else could you be spending this money on as a question to ask if you're looking at the impact nuclear power has on different societies?
You're listening to the Transformative podcast brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
In this special edition of the RECET Transformative podcast with me, Rosamund Johnston, we revisit the RECET Festival in a tent on the campus of the University of Vienna earlier this month, where I was joined by 3 experts on nuclear energy to discuss its dark past and, perhaps, its green future. Stephen Gross is the author of Energy and Power, Germany in the Age of Oil, Atoms and Climate Change, released by Oxford University Press last year. He was joined by Elisabeth Röhrlich, author of Inspectors for Peace, a history of the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA for short. Last but not least, our nuclear panel consisted of Anna Weichselbraun from the Department of European Ethnology at the University of Vienna, who's just finishing a manuscript on knowledge production processes at the IAEA. I started by asking Stephen Gross how important climate had historically been in debates about the rollout of nuclear power.
I'll come at this question from the German standpoint, which I know best. I think in the 1950s and 1960s, when nuclear power was first emerging and being supported by the state, that climate change played a very small role. Climate knowledge, there's a very detailed history of climate knowledge going back to the late 19th century. But really, climate change only became politicized on an international level sometime in the mid-1980s. And so the rollout of nuclear power initially happened before climate was a question. There were other environmental factors that I think got raised around nuclear power, more dealing with local pollution and excess heat, dealing with radioactive storage, obviously, but climate change played a very minimal role. And it wasn't until the 1980s and the 1990s where you see governments, in this case, the German government run by the CDU, really kind of tapping into climate change as an argument for continuing nuclear power. No new nuclear plants were built in Germany after 1982, but there was a big debate that began even before Chernobyl in 1986, reached a larger crescendo in the late 1980s after Chernobyl about whether nuclear power should remain in Germany or whether the existing reactors should be shut off. And the CDU, the right of center party, and the FDP both argued, using climate change, that nuclear power is a carbon-free energy that should be kept on and should not be turned off. And here they were opposed to the Greens and the SPD. So there is this. Climate enters into the picture, at least in the history of nuclear, I mean, relatively late, but now this is a big issue.
Elisabeth and Anna, I think both of you have looked in your research at the rebranding, shall we say, of nuclear energy as green energy. And I think that both of you maybe have some reasons to question, right, that simple kind of connection. So I don't know which of you would like to go first, but what do you think about this sort of 1980s, 1990s, more recent attempt to rebrand nuclear energy as green energy?
First of all, maybe responding to what Stephen said, I think it's important to note that this is not an entirely recent phenomenon. Stephen talked about the German case. If you look at other countries, Sweden, for instance, there you have it already earlier. So in the 1970s, in Sweden, this was an important argument of the pro-nuclear people that nuclear energy had positive environmental aspects, advantages over fossil fuels. There was already some talk about acid rain and the benefits of nuclear power. So I would say that in a way, this framing of nuclear energy as a clean energy is as old as the anti-nuclear energy movement. So it really develops in connection and response to each other. And you see it after the Chernobyl nuclear accident. Again, that shockingly fast after the accident, people, for instance, at the IAEA argued that coal, for instance, had also risks, and they tried to see what is the more dangerous technology.
Maybe with view to the more recent pickup of nuclear energy as green energy, because the examples you were giving both was nuclear energy as compared to fossil fuels. And I think, we've seen the comparison against renewable energies, which obviously have become a lot more cheap
to implement and to roll out. So I think that's one of the considerations that the pro-nuclear green energy movement, obviously it's an argument they have to also mount. I mean, the main argument that nuclear energy has for being green is that it doesn't emit carbon, but that leaves out that it's incredibly resource intensive to build nuclear power plants, that in order to secure fuel, you have to extract them from the earth. Even if there's no accidents, there's an environmental impact and the waste problem still hasn't been solved. So in that sense, I would say it's a questionable rebranding.
So the other perhaps argument in nuclear's favour that one has historically heard and one continues to often hear is that it sort of lowers dependence on foreign sources of energy. I wanted to ask you, Stephen, if this has in the historical case study that you've looked at of Germany from the 50s onwards, if this has proven to be the case, and then perhaps the kind of flip side of it, what sorts of international networks of exchange and dependence do you find nuclear energy actually comes to foster?
The OECD issues a series of energy kind of studies in 55 and 1960 that look at Europe's looming energy problem. This is when kind of there's a big wave of oil that's being excavated and pulled out of the Middle East and channeled to Europe, and European leaders, both in Brussels and in Germany, are increasingly concerned about energy dependency. The Suez Canal crisis in 1956 kind of is a clear illustration of this, where the canal is closed, two-thirds of European oil was going through the canal or the neighboring pipelines. And so this kind of shocked German policymakers and worried European policymakers as well. And so nuclear power was rolled out as a clear alternative to fossil fuels, which, in the case of oil, came from elsewhere for the European case. So this is a long-standing argument, I think. People took issue with this, obviously, because where you source uranium is a big question.
Yeah, in addition to what Stephen just said, it's not just the fuel that's sort of a concern or where that comes from, but also the facilities themselves. There's only a few large companies that can build nuclear power plants, and most of them are also, nuclear weapon states. So Russia is actually a big producer of nuclear and exporter of nuclear power plants that are called turnkey. So they come and they, with their employees as well, and they will build you a nuclear power plant where you'd like it. Whether that nuclear energy is very resource intensive, requires standards of industrialization that are unevenly distributed around the world. And so obviously geopolitical alliances play an important role in the way that nuclear power gets distributed.
So I would like to turn to this kind of like global level, or this oversight at the global level now, and over to you, Elisabeth. You have written extensively about this, and specifically about some of the paradoxes of the way that nuclear energy is kind of managed at the international level through the IAEA. I think that you point out in particular that on the one hand, the purpose of the IAEA is to promote nuclear technologies, and then on the other hand, it's tasked with controlling them and controlling their rollout. So I wanted to ask if the association has ever really kind of managed to reconcile these two aims with which it's been tasked.
This realization that nuclear technologies has beneficial and harmful uses was there right from the beginning of the nuclear age. Even when you, for instance, read H.G. Wells' The World Set Free, a science fiction novel of 1913, you have already this idea of nuclear weapons, but also of a source of endless energy. So this was there right from the beginning of the nuclear age. With the establishment of the United Nations, the international community also tried to handle this complex situation. But in the beginning, it didn't manage to, because all attempts at global governance of nuclear technology focused on denial. And that didn't work out in the early Cold War. And when the IAEA was established after US President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech, he shifted the attention to the promotion of civilian users, which at the time, the idea was that with the focus on civilian users, there would be less material available for nuclear weapons programs, which was really too simple. But yeah, since then, the IAEA, which is the largest and oldest international organization that we have in Austria, is trying to handle this dual mandate of promotion of control. And of course, there are paradoxes, because if states have access to nuclear technologies, know-how, materials, of course, they are better equipped to build nuclear weapons should they decide to do so. And the IAEA tries to handle that not by actual control, but by verification, inspections, things like that. And that's what the agency does. Some call it a nuclear lobbyist because of that. Others say it's an important international organization that at least bring states together to negotiate. Others say it created its own problem. It wouldn't have to deal with so much non-proliferation stuff if it hadn't distributed this technology.
I wonder to what extent we can have a panel about nuclear energy that doesn't just head-on tackle nuclear weapons too. I wanted to ask you, Anna, in particular, because I know that you've written a lot about the devastation of nuclear weapons and of Chernobyl, right? Like, what is the historic relationship between civil or civilian and military kind of nuclear projects?
Well, if you look at the history of the development of nuclear technologies, obviously it starts with the bomb, which also engendered the realization that, if we could, didn't just make this go boom, but we harnessed it, we could, produce a lot of energy that, was promised to be too cheap to meter. In the 1950s, that became sort of in concert with the companies that were vying to enter, especially the American companies that were vying to enter this new energy market, became a way for the United States to distract away from sort of the proliferation of weapons they were building. So the 1950s really saw the greatest increase in the American stockpile of atomic bombs. And so in 1953, President Eisenhower gave a speech that became famously titled Atoms for Peace, which is the IAEA's motto to this day, in which he proposed that nuclear power could be, spread across the world for the benefit and of everyone. And in this way, sort of harness, the military atom and transform it into a peaceful one. So you could say that it was initially already a distraction from the arms race. And meanwhile, like I said, there's a long sort of history in between that. But if we want to think about the potential for a world free of nuclear weapons, so nuclear disarmament as a goal that we might still want to aspire to, found quite interesting. Leonard Weiss, U.S. Senate staffer, who is very important in the development of a lot of nuclear non-proliferation policy in the United States, has sort of come to this realization that it's really nuclear power that's like now serving as a justification for nuclear weapons. And if we didn't have any nuclear power plants anymore, then it would be a lot easier to verify sort of the absence of military use.
Maybe only quickly about this aspect of Eisenhower's speech and the American initiative being a distraction from nuclear weapons. I completely agree. Nevertheless, I think it's important to look at the global situation as well, so that Eisenhower's speech was enthusiastically received at the United Nations. Many states were very interested in nuclear technologies, especially in the then so-called developing world. And I think this is important to keep in mind as well. So not to take away the agency of those countries globally that had an active interest in nuclear technologies because they thought this might be an important resource of energy. Yeah, that's, I think, important to add.
Given a lot of what we've been saying so far, it's maybe perhaps a bit surprising the kind of the connection that was made and that endured between nuclear energy and peace and prosperity, two terms that have come up several times today. It's been mentioned that this was largely, an Eisenhower speech. Should we see this as a sort of totally top-down connection? And should we see this as a thing of the past? How did such links become forged? Was it a question of kind of like US geopolitics and the success of it? Or are there other reasons that this was seen as kind of full future narrative, I suppose, for nuclear energy?
It's not only the Americans that are putting a lot of work, intellectual work, publicity work into delinking atomic energy from atomic weapons. The Germans had to do this as well. I mean, Germany is a, in contrast to France, the UK, Britain, Russia, it's not a nuclear power. But there was a huge debate in the late 1950s that kind of cohered around the Göttingen Manifesto, where there had to be a lot of intellectuals, scientists coming out and saying that we want a peaceful atomic program and that we do not want a nuclear weapons program, right? And that some people in the government, Adenauer, Franz Josef Strauss, actually were inclined to kind of push in the direction of developing Germany as a nuclear power. But there was resistance to that. So there is a story there that's playing out. Again, this happens after Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech, but there's work that has to be done. In my reading of things, Euratom as well is a key part of this, kind of advocating atomic power is something that's important and peaceful. And in the German case, a little bit in the European case, more broadly, atomic power gets linked above all to economic development. This is seen as a technology that Europe and Germany must have if they want to be and continue to be globally competitive as a modern industrial economic powerhouse. That Germans in particular, Europeans in general, I think were afraid of losing a technological edge, losing engineering power, losing the ability of kind of big science, government, and industry to collaborate if they did not push ahead with nuclear power. So I think there's a way that nuclear energy gets linked to different things and to different different kind of thematic questions over history. Eventually it gets linked to climate change, but in the 50s and 60s, it was very much linked to the question of economic modernization, and that this is a technology that has to be, the countries who want to be, growing industrial economies that are high tech with scientific prowess, that they have to develop nuclear power in order to kind of have that edge. So that's kind of where I see this important work being done that's happening not only kind of at the American level, but it's happening also at the European level. And it's not only politicians who are making this argument of linking nuclear power to economic development, but scientists, industrial leaders as well, and particular industries as well, like the electrotechnical industry and the chemical industry, who have big kind of reasons to be involved in nuclear power for refining purposes and for actually building the reactors.
Let's look at the level of the international community. Elisabeth, what would you say?
I wanted to add one thing, because we have been talking about nuclear power and nuclear weapons, especially now with this question about peace and prosperity. And I think it's important to keep in mind that it's not just about nuclear weapons and nuclear power, but especially during the early rollout of nuclear technologies. But still today, it's a lot about all sorts of other civilian applications in medicine, agriculture, and so on. And this was important during the Cold War, because that was part about like the battle over winning the hearts and minds of the developing world, right? Both for the Soviet Union and the United States. And since you asked about like peace and prosperity, I think when you look at the US or the Western side, it's also interesting to note that this is a rebranding. We talked about rebranding before, about peace in the Cold War, because peace, that was the notion that was linked to the Soviets, right? And the Americans had freedom as the opposite notion. So also in this regard, I think it's interesting to look at that.
I want to stick with the kind of economics of this and the idea of prosperity and thinking about like where the money is going a little bit more, and turn to you, Stephen, because you've written a lot about the kind of economics of different forms of energy in your book. I wanted to ask you about energy markets and to what extent you find historically they have been actively and less directly actually shaped by states and then international organizations, for example, like the IAEA.
I mean, I think energy as a field is almost categorically and heavily influenced by the state, no matter what energy you're looking at. Nuclear, coal, oil, renewables as well, that every energy system, you can see the presence of the state quite heavily. I tend to follow the view that, markets in general, there's nothing necessarily natural about them, that they're, mostly constructed by states and institutions, creating frameworks or kind of even more aggressively doing things. In the case of nuclear power, I draw from Mariano Mazzucato's idea of the entrepreneurial state, that the states everywhere in Europe, America, Soviet Union, obviously, took a heavy role in developing nuclear power, taking on the risk of the potential meltdown. So, how do you ensure something like a nuclear power plant like that? That was a question that would have doomed the nuclear industry from the beginning in the 1950s and 1960s. But America and Germany kind of found ways around this by the state basically assuming the insurance risk in the event of a meltdown. Everywhere you look, in the case of nuclear power, initial development was heavily state subsidized through various techniques. But this is not abnormal in the case of energy. I think even the oil market in the 1950s and 60s is portrayed in Europe as kind of the quintessential market-based energy source. It's not, subsidized directly the way that the coal industry becomes. But there are other ways that the state very aggressively intervenes in the oil market. America in the 1950s extends a security umbrella across the Middle East that creates kind of these massive depreciation allowances for Exxon, Aramco, Shell, in the case of Britain, to develop Mideastern oil. It heavily subsidizes pipeline development. In Europe, pipelines and refineries are heavily subsidized as well. The Marshall Plan gives out a lot of aid. One of the biggest line items in the Marshall Plan goes towards building refineries in Europe, for example. So this is a case even in the energy that kind of in our storytelling is taken to be the most market-based, like oil, very much is the product of subsidies and state development. Renewables as well. I mean, the big, boom in renewables happens after 2000 in Europe with Germany's feed-in tariff, and that's a very clear case of the state coming in and setting a very high price paid to producers of renewables to guarantee that they get a profit for a long time, for 10 to 20 years. So this is another example of an energy transition that was very heavily pushed by the state. So I think that, the devil is in the details, but categorically, the state is almost always there in kind of developing new energies and continuing the persistence of old energies.
So I want to stick at the level of the state and recognise where we are today and turn to Elisabeth Röhrlich, who, among other things, is a preeminent expert on Austria and Austrian history. This state is kind of famous for being really opposed to nuclear energy. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the kind of historical, perhaps legislative roots of that.
Next to Austrian neutrality, the opposition towards nuclear energy seems to be one of the few things that almost all Austrians can agree upon. But interestingly, this is not just a strong opposition. That is part of the constitutional law in Austria. Since 1999, Austria is by law, by constitutional law, I want to add, atom-free. You might ask yourself, how can Austria be atom-free? Aren't we all made of atoms? But that's how the legislation is called. And this law was the result of a longer process in the 1950s and 60s, and even in the early 1970s, there was an overall understanding, like in other countries, that nuclear energy will be the power source of the future. It was promoted by the leading parties, both the conservatives and the social democrats. But then opposition slowly grew in the beginning in Vorarlberg in the west of Austria, because the Swiss were building a nuclear power plant and people were concerned. And this was, the anti-nuclear movement in Austria was an important example of the new social movements and was largely inspired also by the West German protest. But interestingly, Austria, as you probably are all aware, maybe not Stephen, Austria built a nuclear power plant, which is still there. It was completed, but it never went online because there was a Volksabstimmung, which is the strongest form of referendum you have in Austria, that eventually prevented this nuclear reactor in Zwentendorf to go online. And it's still there. And you can visit it. It's used to train anti-terror units and to film movies. It even now produces energy, but solar energy, interestingly. So in the discussions on the energy security of Austria in recent years, sometimes you could read in newspapers articles posing the question, shouldn't we maybe put Zwentendorf online and use it? But that's really a very counterfactual question, because first of all, Austrian law doesn't allow it. And second of all, many parts of it have been sold. The containment is breached. So no chance, even if you wanted to have Zwentendorf online.
So I would like to close the panel table discussion part of this event just with a question both to you, Stephen, and to you, Anna, about, Stephen, for you particularly, and Anna, for you more kind of theoretically, how you find the choice for and indeed against nuclear energy to have shaped the societies that you are studying.
The question of nuclear power profoundly shaped German society. The legacy is still there today, that there was such a powerful anti-nuclear movement that, became the Green Party, but it profoundly shaped the other political parties. And this had such a big impact on Germany that they decided to phase out their nuclear reactors. The decision was first made in 2000 under the Red-Green coalition. It was reversed under Merkel after she came to power. And then it was reversed again after Fukushima. And so this has put Germany in tension with other members of the European Union about what is green energy. Germany is a heavily anti-nuclear society, although that has kind of, polling had shifted after 2020 and 2022, but I think it profoundly shaped German society. And this is a legacy that we're dealing with today, the kind of lingering tension over how to deal with climate change and whether nuclear can play a part in that. That in the case of Germany, that they have entirely ruled out nuclear, and that's put them in tension with France and other Northern European states. But I should also say that I think, that nuclear power in Europe and in the West doesn't really have a good future right now. It's horribly expensive. And this is something that we haven't gotten to yet. But if you're looking at kind of green technologies that are ways to fight climate change and reduce carbon emissions, that, everywhere you look in the West, the quote unquote West at least, that nuclear power is just so expensive. The Hinkley Point plant that just came on in Georgia cost $32 billion. It's costing the taxpayers and the electricity payers of Georgia an immense amount of money. So there is a sense, I think, only in the last 5 or 10 years that nuclear power has become too expensive. China is a different case, where China is actually building nuclear power plants. But I think most places where you look outside of China, perhaps India, that nuclear power is very expensive. So I question the role that nuclear actually has to play in the near future when we talk about dealing with climate change.
Thank you for raising the question of how much it costs, Stephen. I had written down sort of what else could you be spending this money on as a question to ask if you're looking at the impact nuclear technologies, nuclear power has on different societies. If you look at North Korea, there's obviously an investment going on there that might be put to better use in other domains of that society. But whenever you think about, large scale industrial infrastructure, you need to ask questions about the social, the political, the environmental, and the health implications of that technology. And sort of, going back to Langdon Winter, that none of these technologies are neutral in and of themselves, but sort of depend on their impacts on how they're designed and implemented and governed. And in the case of nuclear, on the one hand, you have huge timescales, and you could ask the question, can it be democratic if this waste is going to be around for thousands of years? And in the case of the US, there's a great effort being done to find sites for nuclear waste storage. And the communities that they're targeting, the Department of Energy is targeting, are underserved communities that don't really have much else, that are, in the imaginary of the DOE being sort of, democratically sort of shepherded towards the choice to accept being a site of nuclear waste. But you can, ask the question, how much choice do you have if, half of your community is unemployed? So, in addition to the timescales and the sort of social and economic inequality that plays a role with where the waste goes, you can also think of the rare but, severe accidents that happen. And then also coming back to sort of full circle, the political dimensions and the sort of geopolitical sensitivities that structure not just nuclear, but, all energy technologies. So to think about the implications of those, I think is important. And then just with the perspective also of increasingly volatile climate and environments, how can you ensure the security and safety of these like very risky, huge pieces of infrastructure?